Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 24, The New Dystopias. This is the fourth episode about the various kinds of disaster stories that appeared during the New Wave. We've seen fantastical apocalypses, nuclear war, and environmental collapse. But alongside those came a new wave of stories about oppressive governments and societies. Although post-apocalyptic stories are often also considered dystopian, I'm going with the stricter definition. We first studied dystopian fiction in episode 9, but in that episode, we focused on what I call the classic dystopias, like 1984 and Brave New World. These books were very different from later works, pre-Golden Age, at least culturally, if not always chronologically. 1984 and its kin are often imitated, but rarely truly replicated, because they carry an aura of hopelessness and futility that turns the standard trope of the hero's journey upside down, something later works tend to miss. The four books I count as the classic dystopias all feature a protagonist who starts in a relatively privileged position in society, but then falls into rebellion and is crushed by the state in a way that shows how irresistible its power is. I find that this trajectory mirrors many parts of the hero's journey in a reverse fashion. If you want more information, I wrote an essay about it on my blog, link in the description. Dystopian fiction has remained popular all these years later, and new stories are being written all the time. But there's a key difference. Most of these newer stories have traditional heroes. The hero is usually someone who starts on the outs, on the bottom rung of society. Alex in A Clockwork Orange is a juvenile delinquent. Of Fred is a concubine by another name. Katniss Everdeen is a nobody from the poorest district in Panem. Even Logan III, while he was previously a powerful Sandman, immediately became an unperson when he turned 21. Jonas from The Giver, as the receiver of memories, may be a rare exception. This hero, who starts on the bottom, must then work his or her way up to escape or otherwise defy the oppressive state, or in a few cases even to overthrow it. And where the classic dystopian protagonist inevitably fails, these heroes usually succeed, or at least their fate is left ambiguous. This is the regular hero's journey. From what I've seen, the utter hopelessness of the classic tales has never really been replicated in a major work. For this episode, I'm going to skip over the children's stories, books like John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, John Christopher's Tripod series, and newer titles like The Giver and The Hunger Games. I'll be covering children's sci-fi in the New Wave specifically in a few episodes, and young adult dystopias are a phenomenon that will need a separate discussion all on their own. For now, we'll focus on the new dystopias that appeared in adult novels. Ray Bradbury was already somewhat transitional to this new style of dystopia when he wrote Fahrenheit 451 in 1953. Guy Montag does succeed in escaping the city, albeit only after losing everything else. And the state is overthrown, although it's by a nuclear holocaust. Still, the ending is surprisingly hopeful for a dystopia up to that time. There are a few other examples from the 50s. There's Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, written 1 year earlier, about a world where machines have replaced most human workers, leaving the masses with nothing to do. That one hits close to home these days. I've mentioned The Chrysalids a couple times, and there's Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. It's a dystopia with a very different political bent, but it's still a dystopia. Although it's probably a weak example. By her standards, the state was doomed to fail eventually, and John Galt's victory was never in doubt. But we're talking about the 60s, and the first well-known dystopia from that decade comes from another Vonnegut work, his famous short story, Harrison Bergeron. In Harrison Bergeron, the United States has, unusually by constitutional amendment rather than revolution, been converted to a society where equality is strictly enforced. This being a Vonnegut story, the idea is taken to absurd lengths. In order that no one has an unfair advantage at anything, physically or emotionally, smart people have distracting noises played in their ears. Strong people must wear heavy weights around their necks. and beautiful people are required to wear ugly masks. All of it enforced by a new government official called the Handicapper General. The title character of the story is superhumanly strong and intelligent, and he rebels against the system, nearly succeeding before the Handicapper General shows up to even the score. This is an odd one for 1961. Like Fahrenheit 451 with the state's don't offend anyone logic, Harrison Bergeron seems to have a certain political slant by today's standards. In fact, it seems so conservative on its face that the right-wing magazine National Review reprinted it as early as 1965. And it's been quoted by conservative judges up to and including Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. But Vonnegut was a socialist. This can't have been the intended meaning of the story, can it? Something doesn't add up. In fact, in 2005, in response to being quoted by a different judge, Vonnegut spoke against the conservative interpretation of his story. He didn't explain exactly, but he seems to have been pointing at the subtler ways society unfairly handicaps people, such as poverty. Link to that interview in the description. But there might be more to it. I also found an interesting article by literature professor Darryl Hattenhauer, who suggests that Harrison Bergeron was, to simplify a bit, a double satire. A parody of how the right wing views socialism and communism, and, for that matter, equality. In other words, it's an example of Poe's law, where it's hard to tell satire apart from a sincere argument. If that's true, then National Review took the bait and reprinted something that was actually making fun of them. I don't know if Vonnegut corroborated this theory, but it hangs together. It's especially telling that Harrison is not a liberator, but a would-be emperor, and names barons and dukes and earls to rule the populace with him. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Next, probably the most widely read dystopia of the new wave is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. And this one goes to some weird and uncomfortable places. On its face, this book seems the least like a dystopia. From the outside, this near-future Britain probably looks gang-ridden and in the grip of a crime wave, but otherwise functional. To the protagonist, however, it's a different story. The book's protagonist, known only as Alex, is a juvenile delinquent who makes that label look like an understatement. He and his gang like to run around beating people up, doing drugs, robbing stores, stealing cars, and doing far worse things that I won't even describe because I'm trying to keep this podcast at least somewhat family-friendly. But he also seems to be the kind of juvenile delinquent who is smart but doesn't apply himself. He's clearly intelligent, able to outwit his friends, or droogs, and is a great lover of classical music. When Alex accidentally kills one of his victims, something he tries to avoid because he knows the law will come down on him, he's swiftly arrested and convicted of murder. So far, so good. But then the dystopian element creeps in, as some government official gets it into his head to try a new method of rehabilitating criminals. Alex is subjected to an aggressive and painful conditioning process that makes him violently ill at the thought of violence, no pun intended. You may have seen the meme from the Stanley Kubrick film of Alex strapped to a chair with his eyes held open with little clips. And, because they were so closely linked in his mind, he also becomes violently ill from his beloved classical music. Which turns out to be the least of his problems, because being conditioned against violence also makes him unable to defend himself from violence from his many enemies looking for revenge. When the pain drives him to jump out a window, it creates so much bad publicity that the government takes him back and reverses his conditioning, turning him back to his old self. It's an odd case because the dystopia isn't society as a whole. Even with the crime wave, the government is more or less competent and reacts proportionally when called upon. The conditioning process that could become the backbone of an oppressive state in the future is nipped in the bud when it fails so badly with the first test subject. The dystopia is only in Alex's own life, or at most just his own violent subculture. It's a strange book for other reasons, too. Famously, it was written entirely in a made-up slang dialect called Nadsat. still recognizably English, but so heavily laced with Cockney rhyming slang, Russian words, old-timey these and thous, and a few other sources, that it sometimes takes a while to figure out what the characters are talking about. Since it's written in the first person and almost stream of consciousness in Alex's head, this is one where I would especially recommend the audiobook. It's something that needs to be heard. The title of the book comes from the phrase "queer as a Clockwork Orange," which was apparently Cockney slang, not rhyming. It simply suggests something strange or improbable. Just like in America we would say queer as a $3 bill. This is in the older sense of the word queer, meaning strange, not the Q in LGBTQ. Or at least Burgess claimed that was the origin, although I suspect him of being an unreliable narrator in this case. He offered several other explanations over the course of his life. In story, it's the title of another book written by one of Alex's victims, and it symbolizes Alex's loss of free will, being reduced to a sort of absurdist wind-up toy. But I think the strangest part of the book, maybe even stranger than Nadsat, is the tale of the last chapter. You see, in American editions of the book until 1986, and in the Stanley Kubrick film, the editors decided to remove the entire last chapter. In Burgess's original last chapter, set several years after the rest of the book, Alex has gone from being the youngest member of his gang to the oldest, and his life of quote-unquote ultra-violence no longer holds such appeal for him. After seeing one of his former friends having reformed and married, he decides that maybe it's time to grow up and become a productive member of society. It sounds ridiculous. American publishers said that Americans would never go for that ending, that it was far too British, and that it would work better with Alex simply returning to his life of crime. Which ending is more jarring? To me, as an American, I have to agree that it's the British version. In the edited American version, Alex does all sorts of terrible things, including murder and worse, is captured, fails at rehabilitation so badly that he has to be unrehabilitated, mainly because it was an ill-conceived torture device, and he goes right back to what he was doing, only this time it's with a little scrap of moral high ground over the police and the government. Without that last chapter, with Alex being a villain protagonist and us being inside his head for the whole book, it makes him sympathetic enough in a magnificent bastard sort of way to soften the blow of him being such a terrible person. In the British version, however, all that stuff happens, and he still does all sorts of terrible things, except now he grows out of it, like it was just a phase he was going through. And in a weird way, that brings it all back into sharp relief. For Alex as a mature adult to downplay all the wrong he did as just a phase, even if not in so many words, well, it's something that wouldn't fly today, even less so than in the 60s. With all this craziness, you kind of have to wonder what Burgess was thinking when he wrote it. Well, he wondered that too. In 1985, he repudiated the book, not for its message, but because it was far too easy for readers and especially viewers of the film to misinterpret its message as glorifying sex and violence. He was actually trying to explore the ideas of free will and conditioned behavior, as in the experiments of B.F. Skinner. The trouble is that he took too extreme a path for the backdrop of that exploration and wound up with what Wikipedia calls, quote, a dystopian satirical black comedy, unquote, which largely subsumed the original message. So yeah, that's a pretty wild one. Meanwhile, there's one other famous dystopia from the 60s, and that is Logan's Run, by William Francis Nolan and George Clayton Johnson. Logan's Run is probably much better known from the 1976 film adaptation, which is significantly different. But the book is still familiar enough that I want to focus on that instead. As an aside, these authors are quite the odd pair. William Francis Nolan, no relation to Buck Rogers creator Philip Francis Nolan, whose name is spelled differently, is a very prolific writer and editor, but apart from Logan's Run, his involvement in science fiction has been more as an editor of anthologies. Meanwhile, he has written many other pieces of fiction, non-fiction, and even poetry, including for mainstream magazines like Sports Illustrated, Rogue, and Playboy. Meanwhile, George Clayton Johnson also appeared in magazines, but he's better known for his screenplay credits. He wrote several episodes of The Twilight Zone, the very first televised episode of Star Trek, The Man Trap, and he co-wrote one notable non-sci-fi film, the original Ocean's 11. Logan's Run is a story about overpopulation, but I didn't talk about it in the last episode because that isn't really the focus. The main focus is on the dystopian society that resulted. This world controls its population by euthanizing everyone at the age of 21. Most people are conditioned to simply accept this, but obviously some people take issue with this and become runners who try to escape. Logan 3, because people have numbers here, is a Sandman, whose job it is to hunt down and kill runners, also known as Deep Sleep. But when he turns 21, he has a change of heart and becomes a runner himself, while also uncovering some of the secrets of the system. And of course, like a traditional hero, he succeeds in escaping. I confess I haven't read this one, but I can see one obvious issue with it, which is that Logan's Run suffers from a similar problem to other stories about overpopulation of not doing the math. In the opening lines of the book, Nolan and Johnson explain how this world came about. Quote, "The seeds of the Little War were planted in a restless summer during the mid-1960s, with sit-ins and student demonstrations as youth tested its strength." Unquote. This rise in the political power of the youth was joined by an increase in their numbers. The authors claimed that, with the population boom of the 60s, the youth fraction of the population would rise the fastest, which is true. The problem is that the opening of the book says that over 82% of the world population was under age 21 before the revolution. Just intuitively, with 5 children for every adult, and adults covering male and female and multiple generations, you'd think the world would struggle to produce children at that rate. I did some calculations, and it turns out it's theoretically possible, but it's near the physical limits of what a human population can produce, well beyond any historical precedent. I've written a companion post on my blog explaining the math behind it, link in the description. The movie, perhaps wisely, changed the age limit to 30 years old. I think this loses something aesthetically by not being a world truly run by teenagers, but it does make the world make more sense. Although in practice, this change was probably motivated by the studio being able to hire older actors, and possibly a play on the hippie slogan of "Don't trust anybody over 30. Now, those are the major examples from the new wave. Obviously, there are many other examples from later years, but most of those books we're going to come back to in the future. One of the most famous is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, about a pseudo-Christian fundamentalist dictatorship taking over the United States and its particular harmful effects on women. We'll come back to that in the episode on feminist sci-fi. There's also Lois Lowry's The Giver, as I mentioned, which was the young adult dystopia for about a decade before the 21st century wave of them picked up. We'll come back to that in later episodes on children's sci-fi. Ditto for the Chrysalids and the Tripod series. I also mentioned Harlan Ellison's short story, "Repent, Harlequin," said the TikTok man, where always being on time is enforced with deadly consequences in the introduction to the new wave in episode 19. There are a few other notable examples. This Perfect Day by Ira Levin, better known for Rosemary's Baby, is a dystopia about a world where everyone's life is run by a central computer, and the people are constantly drugged to keep them happy and content. Stephen King wrote a pair of books with rather similar premises, The Long Walk and The Running Man, both perhaps precursors to the Hunger Games, where people enter deadly contests, albeit seemingly voluntarily in this case, for the entertainment of the public. These books may themselves be prefigured by 2 films, the original Death Race 2000 and Rollerball, both produced in 1975. Although it's notable that The Long Walk was the first book King ever wrote, having started it in 1966, several years before Carrie. Speaking of films, dystopian worlds show up quite a bit there, but it's with more of a cyberpunk vibe. Max Headroom, Demolition Man, that sort of thing. There are a few earlier ones, of course. George Lucas's original breakout film, THX 1138, which later lent its name to Lucasfilm's sound division, depicts a world where everyone has a number instead of a name, with android police and everyone being drugged, and honestly the description reads a lot like This Perfect Day. It seems to be a coincidence, though. This Perfect Day was published in 1970, while George Lucas made THX 1138 in 1969, but released it in 1971. There's no opportunity for a connection. Alphaville, another movie from a few years earlier, also has a very similar theme. In this case, a city ruled by a central computer, which suppresses all emotions among the populace. Alphaville is a French film. I feel like it's not well known in America, but it's worth mentioning because it made Rotten Tomatoes' list of the top science fiction films. Perhaps this theme was repeated so often as a result of computers first coming into the public consciousness around that time. Meanwhile, even if they're not proper cyberpunk, many new dystopias still drew on the punk aesthetic from the 80s or a little before. See other films like Mad Max, the Judge Dredd comic book series, and two of Alan Moore's famous graphic novels, V for Vendetta and Watchmen. It was also a common theme in punk rock and heavy metal music in the 80s. In newer times, the cyberpunk dystopia theme lives on in video games like BioShock and Half-Life. There are a couple of dystopian movies from the 80s that might be worth a special mention. Films that appear on lists of dystopias proper, rather than generic cyberpunk. One is Terry Gilliam's Brazil, which goes in a little bit different direction with a satirical treatment of the dystopia of bureaucracy, the surveillance state, and corporatism. Perhaps issues we can especially relate to today. The other is John Carpenter's They Live, which you might also know from the internet memes, where Roddy Piper puts on the sunglasses and sees that all the billboards and TV screens are sending subliminal messages to obey. And many humans are secretly aliens in disguise with really creepy skull-like faces. Okay, your head is probably spinning after all of these titles. I know mine is. Honestly, I'm not sure where I was going with this part. I guess it's mainly to show how the subgenre of dystopian fiction really picked up in the 70s and 80s. How the few big names of the classic dystopias gave way to a plethora of newer stories, often with new themes befitting their time, and very often with a more hopeful attitude that really set them apart from the earlier generation. And that is a trend that is still going strong, so keep that in mind when we circle back around to this topic in the future. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available on all the major platforms and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com, where you can also see my analysis of the demographics of Logans Run. I'm going to go a little off script and make a short story recommendation for Harrison Bergeron instead of my usual book recommendation. You see, I haven't actually read many of the books I've mentioned in this episode. Not many of them are on people's lists of classics, and most of the ones I have read are like The Chrysalids and The Handmaid's Tale that we'll come back to in more detail later. That leaves me with the only book available for me to recommend being A Clockwork Orange. And while it's an ingeniously written book, and I enjoyed it, I'm hesitant to officially recommend it. For one, it's kind of atypical for a dystopia, and also it's a bit too graphic for my tastes, in a way that even other villain protagonist books like The Demolished Man aren't. So I think I'm going to leave it off my recommended list. You may disagree with that, and you're welcome to have at it. I'm going to stick with Harrison Bergeron. There's a link to the full text in the description, courtesy of archive.org. Just be sure to keep the author's original intent in mind when you read it. In the next episode, we can finally escape the dreary breakdown of society from the last several episodes and return to space travel for one of my favorite concepts in science fiction. It's finally time to explore strange new worlds. Thanks for listening.